Great Britain was made from the words of the great and the not-so-great. As much as anything, it is a place made of words and speeches and half-remembered lines. But the writers and speechmakers who made this country known to itself have never been one thing. They have never been in agreement with each other. Many of them are pictured here, side by side in this national mausoleum to the mighty facts of ongoing reputation. They are fixed now, the expressions on their faces final, unchanging. But some of the greatest British writers are hidden by their reputation, or hidden behind the reputation of others. Behind Samuel Johnson several names are buried. The most important of them all is James Boswell, remembered as the great biographer, the author of the Life of Johnson. As an accessory after the fact to Johnson's fame, he was considerably more than that. To me, he was one of the great innovators in British literature.
I am too fat at present. My belly... The immense Donaldson and I sat a while at Dempster's. I would have got rich lace clothes, but I commanded my inclination. I am so fond of tea that I could write a whole dissertation on it. I was elevated somewhat by drinking little more than a pint of... Went and dined at Lord Eglinton's, without having been invited. I indulged myself today in a fancy which pleased me more than anyone would believe. I should live no more than I can record. There is a waste of good if it be not preserved. At night, indolence made me think, why give myself so much labour to write this journal, in which I really do not insert much that can be called useful? Beg your pardon? Does it not contain a faithful register of my variations of mind? Does it not contain many ingenious observations and pleasing strokes which can afterwards be enlarged? Well, but I may die. True, but I may live. And what a rich treasure for my after days will be this, my journal.
James Boswell's journal, one of the most spectacular diaries in English literature, lay under dust for 140 years. Its 8,000 manuscript pages lay in the corners of several grand houses till their discovery in the 1930s. The first volume was published at last in 1950, and it became an instant bestseller. It achieved what its author had always wanted, respect and acceptance in the English capital. Here was a writer we had thought we knew, but did not.
My greatest uneasiness was the fear of fear, an apprehension that my nerves, or whatever else it is, should yield to impressions of danger, though my soul was brave. I think there is a meaning here.
Without the journal that he kept from his 22nd year until his death at the age of 55, Boswell would be a smaller and more conventional figure in British literature, a Scottish lawyer of the middle rank, a resolute second fiddle, who justified his existence with a single feat of excellence, the Life of Johnson. But it is his journals which make him great. It is the secret history of a divided mind, duty-bound to this house, the Boswell's family seat in Ayrshire, but a mind also driven to look for life in the worlds beyond these walls.
To get away from here, where I lived as a boy, was my great object. It was irksome beyond measure to be a young laird in the house of a father much different from me, of a mind perfectly sound, who thought that if I was not a man of business, I was good for nothing. I am a singular man. I have the whim of an Englishman to make me think and act extravagantly, and yet I have the coolness and good sense of a Scotsman to make me sensible of it. I am a singular man. November 16th, 1762. When we came upon Highgate Hill and had a view of London, I was all life and joy. I repeated Cato's soliloquy on the immortality of the soul, and my soul bounded forth to a certain prospect of happy futurity. The noise, the crowd, the glare of shops and signs agreeably confused me. I was all in a flutter at having at last got to the place which I was so madly fond of.
James Boswell was a young man of 22 in the year 1762 when he came to London. That was the first proper acquaintance that he developed with the place, and he came in hopes of a great time. He was a great experimenter with his own pleasures. He wanted all the sweetmeats of being, as he referred to them, here in London, and he wasn't disappointed. The place was absolutely sort of rolling from one side to the other with possibilities for someone like him. You know, a good wine, a good lunch, a friendly prostitute or two. That was his idea of a good time, and he was never disappointed here.
This afternoon I went and saw Mrs. Salmon's famous waxwork. I went and saw a collection of wild beasts. Take my walk, healthy and spirited, round the park before breakfast. View the brilliant guards on the parade. I then went with Erskine and had some games at billiards. Not for money. It is a pretty game. My curiosity to see the melancholy spectacle of the execution was so strong, I felt myself bold, easy, and happy. I was all life and joy. I was all life and joy. I was all life and joy. I went to Child's. It is quite a place to my mind. Dusky, comfortable and warm, with a society of citizens and physicians who talk politics very fully and are very sagacious and sometimes jocular. I shall hereafter, for the sake of neatness, throw our conversation into my journal in the form of a dialogue, so that every Saturday this, my journal, shall be adorned with a dialogue at Child's.
The sort of places he's hanging out are between here, where we are in Covent Garden, and then around Fleet Street. Now, you know, we think of Fleet Street as the newspaper press, and that's half true for the period. The newspapers weren't there, but the booksellers, the writers, the hacks were there, and Fleet Street was the main artery of London in those days, because it led from the city down into Whitehall and Westminster. It is the great route that everybody took. And Drury Lane, another area where you could always pick up a plump and lascivious girl. Covent Garden was a sort of mass, a maze of contrasts, the fashionable, the frightful, the swanky and the sordid. This is what Boswell loved. London was absolute electricity to him.
It is very curious to think that I have now been in London several weeks without ever enjoying the delightful sex, although I am surrounded with numbers of free-hearted ladies of all kinds. However, I hope to be more successful. In this view, I had now called several times for a handsome actress of Covent Garden Theatre by the name of Louisa. I was really in love. I acquired confidence by considering my present character in this light, a young fellow of spirit and fashion, heir to a good fortune, enjoying the pleasures of London. I talked on love very freely. "Madam," said I can never think of having a connection with a woman that I don't love. "That, sir," said she, "is only having a satisfaction in common with the brutes." I strolled and took the first whore I met, whom I without many words copulated with, being safely sheathed. She was ugly and lean, and her breath smelt of spirits. I never asked her name. When it was done, she slunk off. I had a low opinion of this gross practice, and resolved to do it no more.
But even then, there's the journalist in Boswell. I mean, the person who just sits in places like Tom King's coffee house and records snippets of conversation. You know, idle and inconsequential things that other people are saying, because he is fascinated by human life and because he's willing to tell his own downs as well as ups. I mean, his appalling sexual escapades as well as his real successful adventures. That sort of sense that he wants to write himself and write himself into history is never very distant from him.
Boswell told the truth about himself and caused many to think him gross and debauched. Literary history would in some sense never forgive him his excesses, and his afterlife has something of dishonour in it. In his own day, some considered him uncouth and a shameless self-advertiser, and in the following century that view took hold. The critic Lord Macaulay wrote that he was one of the smallest men that ever lived, and the laughingstock of the whole of that brilliant society which has owed to him the greater part of its fame.
He really was a bit of a squalid little guy, you know. He was just, and he came to be regarded as a sort of necessary but rather dirty little pipe down which Johnson's wisdom had to dribble in order to get out to the world and be displayed. But there was no reason to pay respect to the drain pipe itself. And that's how he was treated.
When I came home, I felt myself jaded and stupid and uneasy. I was somewhat sick and I had a headache. I was vexed to find myself deviating from my scheme of sober regularity and being really a rake. I made myself easy by thinking that I had just raked 3 nights during the holidays, and I resolved in time coming never to be out at night except on some very particular occasion.
I think we like 2 things. I mean, we probably like angst and guilt and self-reproach and torment more than we really like a full-bodied sensual life. And Boswell, he offers both, as a matter of fact. I mean, there's this famous sort of, I call it Boswell Day, which was the 13th of May, 1785, and he has it in his journal. And he made love to a whore twice before breakfast, then he went and had breakfast with a Quaker lady called Mary Knowles, and then he went to a Quaker meeting, and then after the Quaker meeting and service he went out into Hyde Park and watched Lunardi take a balloon up, and after that he went to Bedlam, walked around looking at the lunatics, you see, and then he went off and he had dinner with a big lawyer, and he got totally bluted, and the next thing he remembered was standing in St. Paul's churchyard singing songs with 2 girls in red cloaks, and then the next thing that happened, he got his pocket picked, and then he fell over in the street, and then he was taken home by 2 gentlemen whose name he couldn't remember. That was the end of that day.
I observed that one who has not seen London has not seen human life, and therefore should not pretend to judge of it. One who has learnt the few notes of a song is no judge of the great compass of music. So one who has not been in London knows a very little of life. He knows not the extent, the variety of combinations.
Or as Johnson put it, the man who is tired of London is tired of life. For Boswell, Johnson was a man to emulate, and he longed to meet him. But when he did, on May the 16th, 1763, he showed himself up with a comical attempt at concealment. He knew about Johnson's antipathy to the Scots, and he tried to hide his nationality, but his hero found him out. "Yes, I am Scottish," said Boswell, "but I cannot help it." Johnson replied that it was something a great many of his countrymen couldn't help. So began one of the strangest and most successful friendships in British literature. In time, Johnson would anglify Boswell, and Boswell would Scotify Johnson, but Johnson was always the senior partner. He was English after all, and Englishness was a kind of religion to them both. One of the things that Boswell learned from Johnson was to revere God, at least in theory. But in practice he found it incredibly difficult to live by the law of God. He was insubordinate as a Christian in much the same way that he was insubordinate as a son. He's the sort of guy who would come here to listen to sermons and all sorts of high-minded subjects, knowing and telling his journal that he couldn't live up to them. That's the sort of man he was. And religion was always a sort of thing on his back. But he paid attention to it, he always did, and was upset by other people who couldn't pay attention to it. Johnson stood there for him as someone closer to God, a kind of representative of God's law on earth and made elegant. But he could never entirely convince himself of that, and his journals can't really convince us of it either.
I breakfasted with Mr. Douglas. I went to St. James's Church and heard service and a good sermon on By What Means Shall a Young Man Learn to Order His Ways, in which the advantages of early piety were well displayed. What a curious, inconsistent thing is the mind of man. In the midst of divine service, I was laying plans for having women, and yet I had the most sincere feelings of religion. I would try to make out a little consistency this way. I have a warm heart and a vivacious fancy. I am therefore given to love, and also to piety, or gratitude to God, and to the most brilliant and showy method of public worship. I then walked in the park, and went home to dinner, which was just a good joint of veal and a pudding. I think there is a blossom about me of something more distinguished than the generality of mankind, but I am much afraid that this blossom will never swell into fruit. Indeed, I sometimes indulge noble reveries of having a regiment, of getting into Parliament, making a figure and becoming a man of consequence in the state. But these are checked by dispiriting reflections on my melancholy temper and imbecility of mind. We behold a man of quality in all the affluence of life. We're apt to imagine this man happy. We're apt to imagine that his gallery is hung with the most delightful paintings. But could we look in it, we should in all probability behold portraits of care, discontent, languor and distraction.
You can almost see in some of these pictures his attempt to look serious and responsible and decorous and those sorts of things, can't you?
That's a middle-aged, toughened-up, experienced Boswell,
Yeah.
who looks entirely different from the rather luscious youth of the painting that was done in Italy. When
Yeah.
shows him in his gorgeous kit that he liked to wear, looking all ruby-faced and ready to go.
He's very kind of luscious and, you know,
Yes.
rosy-cheeked looking there, isn't he?
Yes, he's looking forward to a lifetime of sensations and thoughts maybe too, but certainly sensations. He was a friend not only of Johnson, but of the Frenchman Rousseau, and of the great, perhaps the greatest British philosopher, Scottish philosopher, Hume. And Hume thought he was very charming, very likable, and very mad. These were Hume's rather characteristic expressions for him. The question is, how much trouble was there for him in all this? And I think that his depressions, when you read the journal, you wouldn't guess it from reading the life of Johnson, but when you read the life of Boswell by Boswell, then there rises a curtain on a depressive cycle, often associated with drinking and getting into scrapes and so on, during the worst times of which he really was quite near suicide.
This afternoon I became very low-spirited. I sat in close. I hated all things. I almost hated London. Oh, miserable absurdity. I could see nothing in a good light. I just submitted and hoped to get the better of this.
Then you look further into the family background and you see some history of mental suffering.
Yes, from where did that darkness descend in Boswell? Was it a family thing? Was it to do with his father?
Well, there is a family element to this, yes. The father was a very grim and, I would have thought, rather unloving man, a judge, and who thought his sons were idiots. Then there was the question of one of the sons actually being one, in the sense that, to put it again brusquely, he was for many years in an asylum. And I think what you've said by calling attention to the business of the father is very important. He had this father who was severe with him, who wasn't loving to him. He then seems to have gone seeking other fathers, not just Johnson, other people too.
Did he ever go for help, or did he have ways of dealing with it? How did he sort of handle that infirmity, that uncertainty, that unbalance?
Well, he had to handle it. He had to find ways of dealing with his moods, his highs and his lows. When he was high, what is recorded is he was having a very good time, and he was able to have very good times. But then he had the opposite. One of the most interesting passages in the journal comes in 1776 when he writes, "I was so afflicted with it," that's to say with the black mood of the day, "that I had no just ideas or sensations of any kind. I was anxious to be with Dr. Johnson." Very moving. Johnson suggests that his friend take courses to alleviate his moods. And Boswell writes, "I thought of a course in concubinage." Girls. but was afraid to mention it. I suppose you could say that girls and Dr. Johnson were a part of his therapy.
It gave me great relief to talk of my disorder with Mr. Johnson. And when I discovered that he himself was subject to it, I felt that strange satisfaction which human nature feels at the idea of participating distress with others. And the greater person our fellow sufferer is, so much the more good does it do us. I gave him an account of the family of Auchinleck and of the place. He said I must be there, and we will live in the old castle, and if there is no room remaining, we will build one. This was the most pleasing idea that I could possibly have, to think of seeing this great man at the venerable seat of my ancestors.
Although they were often apart, Johnson was Boswell's great comforter, and the thought that Johnson might one day be with him in Scotland made Boswell's enforced duties there a little more bearable. Johnson was not to visit Auchinleck until 10 years after Boswell's first London jaunt. In the intervening years, Boswell did his best to fall in with his father's wish that he pursue a legal career in Scotland, but he could not resist an annual visit to London to see his great friend. Lord Auchinleck was unsurprised and unimpressed. He knew his son, and on the facade of his house he had carved a Latin inscription, a quote from Horace. In translation, it was both a reminder and a rebuke to Boswell. If you be of calm and contented mind, all that you seek is here, even in this remote place, it said. But Boswell couldn't settle down. He never had a mind for calmness and contentment, and Auchinleck offered no peace. He feared that his mind was not right, and his brother's mental instability only deepened his fear for his own sanity.
We got to Newcastle to dinner. I sent for Dr. Hall, physician, and Mr. Leighton, surgeon. Hall came for a few minutes, told me that my poor brother John was not unhappy, and that he thought it would be most desirable for the family that he should continue in his present state. I sat with him about 10 minutes, I suppose, before he spoke a single word, though I said many things to him and shook him cordially by the hand. I was going to leave him. He put forth his hand, seized mine and said, "Take me with you." I stopped a while with him. I said, "Do you know me?" He said, "To be sure." He said, "Give me some money." I gave him 2 shillings. He said, "Give me some more." I gave him another. He said, "How's your wife?" And he said, "I'm kept a prisoner here." I covered my face for a little and shed tears. There was something very striking to me in this scene. It shook my mind somewhat. Tuesday, 13th November. Had been ill last night from drinking too much port, and was still so much indisposed that I wished to lie in bed. But got up to make my appearance in the Court of Session, thought it dull and poor. I borrowed today out of the Advocate's Library David Hume's Treatise of Human Nature, but found it so abstruse, so contrary to sound sense and reason, and so dreary in its effects on the mind, if it had any, that I resolved to return it without reading it. Drank tea with Mr. George Wallace, after which he and I visited Sir John Pringle, and walked in the meadow with him and his dull women.
This is the consultation book, and it records Boswell's legal career from the time he first was called to the bar. Boswell, who put on the gown 29th July 1766. And it's fascinating because one could see how much money he was actually making, and the kinds of causes in which he was pleading, and the judges before whom he was speaking. And so often it's his own father.
You can see
on the
that.
first page, Auchinleck, Auchinleck, Auchinleck.
Was he a good lawyer, would you say?
I think he was, yes. He was He deeded in some very interesting cases, and he made a reasonable amount of money. Dr. Johnson was very much impressed when Boswell told him how much he'd made. Very good, Bossie, he said.
Yes.
300 guineas a year
Yes.
in some of his
Yes.
early years, which is pretty good.
That good money then.
Very good.
The surprising thing is that this was the great age of the Scottish Enlightenment, and cold, rational inquiry into human nature. That sort of thing had no appeal to him. He was an impulsive, introspective, imaginative, warmly sympathetic character who had really very little sympathy with the Humean ideal of trying to analyse the science of human nature.
Where London put Boswell in mind of life, vivid and various and colourful, Edinburgh put him in mind of death, of being entombed, suffocated, snuffed out. There was something in the atmosphere of Enlightenment Edinburgh that poisoned James Boswell's spirit. Even his good times were not lightsome and gay, as they often were in London, but here his enjoyments were dark and pathological. Most of his Edinburgh exploits speak of desperation. In what was once described as the journalistic scoop of the 18th century, Boswell went to see David Hume just before his death. Hume refused to admit the possibility of an afterlife. Boswell was horrified. It went to the very core of his anxiety. The best minds in Edinburgh, he saw, were allied with oblivion, and he couldn't face the possibility of a long darkness. His response to all this only made him worse. He took to screwing girls in the dim closes and alleyways, and in the graveyards too. A little after Hume's death, he took a girl to a hut next to Hume's house, and he had her there, repeatedly, under the light of a sickly moon. He returned there for the same purpose the best part of a year. You have a letter to
We have indeed a letter about that very point. Boswell wrote after Hume's funeral to Mrs. Thrale, explaining his amazement. It has shocked me to think of his persisting in infidelity. My notion is that he had by long study in one view brought a stupor upon his mind as to futurity. He had pored upon the earth till he could not look up to heaven. He was like one of the Brahmins who, we are told, by rigid perseverance in maintaining a certain posture, became unable to change it. He has to end up by saying what a blessing it is to have a constant face in the Christian revelation, exclamation mark.
Yes.
You know.
Boswell couldn't really bear this. It was intolerable to him. In fact, very interesting, he had a dream, he records much later on, that he found an old diary of David Hume's in which he confessed he was only kidding and he really was a believing Christian all the time.
Yes.
What's this you've got here?
This is the actual copy of Martin's description of the Western Islands that Boswell took with him on the tour with Johnson. He didn't like to risk taking his own copy. He borrowed the Advocates' Library copy, then had the audacity to inscribe it heavily with his comments on. But this is one of those rare occasions when people in libraries are rather pleased when books are defaced.
A higher class.
Absolutely, it makes it so much more valuable and interesting than it would never be taken.
What's he saying there?
This very book accompanied Mr. Samuel Johnson and me in our tour to the Hebrides in autumn 1773, and he goes on to offer some criticisms and some praise. He says at the end that he actually retained some fondness for poor old Martin.
Yes.
And he slunk back into the Advocates' Library and replaced this on the shelf after he'd defaced it in this way.
Dr. Johnson had for many years given me hopes that we should go together and visit the Hebrides. Martin's account of those islands had impressed us with the notion that we might there contemplate a system of life almost totally different from what we had been accustomed to see. He had disappointed my expectations so long that I began to despair. But in spring 1773 he talked of coming to Scotland that year with so much firmness that I hoped he was at last in earnest.
Boswell and Johnson's tour to the Western Isles was the time when they really got to know each other. They came to the Isle of Skye here and stayed at Dunvegan Castle, and it was in that place that Johnson affirmed the work that Boswell was trying to do and affirmed the sort of writer that he was. He told him to record everything, tell the truth, he said, don't leave anything out. And Boswell kept that close to his heart. It became a kind of judgment on the enterprise that he'd been involved in. He felt that Johnson had said it was okay to be the sort of man and the sort of writer that he was.
We set out this morning on our way to Talisker in Ulinich's boat, having taken leave of him and his family. As we sailed along, Dr. Johnson got into one of his fits of railing at the Scots. "We have taught you," said he, "and we'll do the same in time to all barbarous nations, to the Cherokees, and at last to the orangutans," laughing. Boswell: "We had wine before the Union." Johnson: "No, sir. You had some weak stuff, the refuse of France, which would not make you drunk." Boswell: "I assure you, sir, there was a great deal of drunkenness." Johnson: "No, sir. There were people who died of dropsies which they contracted in trying to get drunk." Sunday, 26th September. I awaked at noon with a severe headache. I was much vexed that I should have been guilty of such a riot, and afraid of a reproof from Dr. Johnson. I thought it very inconsistent with that conduct which I ought to maintain while the companion of the Rambler. About 1, he came into my room and accosted me. "What, drunk yet?" His tone of voice was not that of severe upbraiding, so I was relieved a little. "Sir," said I, "they kept me up." He answered, "No, you kept them up, you drunken dog."
What would attract two London literary figures in 1773 to come to a place like this at one of the worst times of the year?
I think the initial impulse was a kind of a romantic one. Boswell had a notion of a kind of summer trip. It wasn't like that. It was an extraordinarily wet autumn, stormy, and we're now actually at the most dangerous part of their voyage. We're between Mull and Call, where they were storm-stayed for several days, and to come across this water with the tidal rips and the wind in late October was extremely dangerous. But this is the most extraordinary Herculean feat by a 63-year-old man, corpulent, with bad knees, supporting himself with his oak staff. And to some extent, I think Johnson was trying to prove at the age of, the kind of mystical age of 63, that he could do it.
We spoke of death. Dr. Johnson on this subject observed that the boastings of some men as to dying easily were idle talk. No wise man will be contented to die if he thinks he is to go into a state of punishment. Nay, no wise man will be contented to die if he thinks he is to fall into annihilation. For however unhappy any man's existence may be, he yet would rather have it than not exist at all. No. There is no rational principle by which a man die contented, but to trust in the mercy of God through the merits of Jesus Christ. This short sermon, delivered with an earnest tone in a boat upon the sea, which was perfectly calm, on a day appropriated to religious worship, while everyone listened with an air of satisfaction, had a most pleasing effect upon the mind.
I think for Johnson there was a constant anxiety, which in some ways looked like agoraphobia, because this man is used to urban space and the control of space, and things run out of control, and there are moments, panic attacks, anxiety attacks of being left alone. But along with that, the whole story is permeated with a kind of death anxiety. And I think, in a certain sense, this landscape, which at one level he was physically triumphing over in the most extraordinary way, given his physical nature. On the other hand, I think it wasn't hell, but it was purgatory. There was a landscape of death to some extent. It's not, Boswell's death anxiety is of a more modern kind. I think Johnson's is traditional Christian guilt.
What do you mean, more modern?
I mean, you can, in some ways you can see Boswell's whole writing career as a kind of antidote to this. In a certain sense, he's, you know, this enormous outpouring is an attempt somehow to give balance and life, you know, to prove to himself that it's all existed, that it's not going to vanish.
Some people might look at these two unwieldy characters falling across the rocks of the Western Isles as a couple of grotesques in a way who have nothing to do with the Britain of that time or this time.
I think they've got almost everything to do with it, and I think in a certain sense the Boswell-Johnson story is a great love story of the Union. It's bringing out the best of the creative sides of both English and Scots. One of Johnson's great wisecracks, which I really love, is he says, "Sir, it is not to be lamented that old England is lost. It is to be lamented that the Scots have found it." Boswell, I do think he understood the symbolism of this relationship, and it was in fact the integration of Scotland and England. It was a marriage of true minds between the two of them, and Johnson did recognise that his recording angel had appeared before him.
Boswell and Johnson came out to the Western Isles from their separate worlds of self-obsession. Could they have come here to enjoy each other's differences, to balance their friendship, and make of themselves a united kingdom? Johnson was England, with all its sense of superiority and high church firmness of mind, and Boswell was Scotland, contradicted and contradicting. I sometimes think the tour to the Western Isles makes the idea of Britain plain. Boswell and Johnson needed each other, like a Scotland needs an England, and in having each other, become better. Boswell and Johnson traversed a Scotland that was pulling away from the past, and here we are again, the union they embodied now shattering in our time, and the waters ahead uncharted and unknown.
We were now in a country not only of saddles and bridles, but of post-chaises, and having ordered one from Kilmarnock, we got to Auchinleck before dinner. My father was not quite a year and a half older than Dr. Johnson. He was as sanguine a Whig and Presbyterian as Dr. Johnson was a Tory and Church of England man, and as he had not much leisure to be informed of Dr. Johnson's great merits by reading his works, he had a partial and unfavourable notion of him. Knowing all this, I should not have ventured to bring them together, had not my father, out of kindness to me, desired me to invite Dr. Johnson to his house. As I wandered with my revered friend in the groves of Auchinleck, I told him that if I survived him, it was my intention to erect a monument to him here, among scenes which, in my mind, were all classical, for in my youth I had appropriated to them many of the descriptions of the Roman poets. He could not bear to have death represented to him in any shape, for his constitutional melancholy made the King of Terrors more frightful. He turned off the subject, saying, "Sir, I hope to see your grandchildren." I cannot be certain whether it was on this day or a former, but Dr. Johnson and my father came in collision. If I recollect right, the father was showing him his collection of medals, and Oliver Cromwell's coin unfortunately introduced Charles I and Toryism. They became exceedingly warm and violent, and I was very much distressed by being present at such an altercation between two men, both of whom I reverenced, yet I durst not interfere. My father's opinion of Dr. Johnson may be conjectured from the name he afterwards gave him, which was Ursa Major, the Great Bear. Notwithstanding the altercation that had passed, my father, who had the dignified courtesy of an old baron, was very civil to Dr. Johnson, and politely attended him to the post-chaise which was to convey us to Edinburgh. Thus they parted. They are now in another and a higher state of existence, and as they were both worthy Christian men, I trust they have met in happiness. Friday, 17th December, 1784. This must be ever remembered as a melancholy day, for it brought me the dismal news of my great and good friend, Dr. Samuel Johnson. I was stunned and in a kind of amaze. I did not shed tears. I was not tenderly affected. My feeling was just one large expanse of stupor. Saturday, 18th December. In the evening I read 2 accounts of Dr. Johnson's death in the Public Advertiser and London Chronicle, and I had a letter from Mr. Dilly mentioning it, and in the true spirit of the trade wanting to know if I could have an octavo volume of 400 pages of his conversation ready by February. I was now uneasy to think that there would be considerable expectations from me of memoirs of my illustrious friend. Sunday, 19th December. Dr. Johnson's death filled me with a kind of amaze. Monday, 20th December. I recollect nothing. Tuesday, 21st December. I recollect nothing. Wednesday, 22nd December. I recollect nothing.
Death did not ultimately take Johnson away from his young friend. In a sense, it gave Johnson to him, once and for all. For 7 years, Boswell worked on his great biography, The Life of Johnson, and it was published in 1791 to fantastic acclaim. He had written Boswell's Johnson, their names firmly wedded in the cover of the best biography ever written. The Life was his great public performance, and much hailed, but Boswell knew that his own secret journals contained as much of himself. The great biographer was only half the writer we now recognise.
I went to Sheridan's to spend the evening. I liked it much, and was well entertained. Mrs. Cholmondeley was there, also a Captain Jeffson, a lively little fellow, the best mimic in the world. Also Colonel Irwin, a genteel, well-bred, pretty man. It was quite a literary dinner. I had seen no warm victuals for 4 days, and therefore played a very bold knife and fork. It is inconceivable how hearty I ate, how comfortable I felt myself after it. We talked entirely in the way of geniuses.
What I love about this book, and what is almost peerless about it, though there are other biographies which pay the same sort of respect, is that you see a life emerging out of very insignificant, apparently, details of dress, behaviour, speech, eating, everything.
He is so various. He is so all over the place. He wants at one stage to be a lawyer. He wants another stage to be in commerce. He wants to be a great biographer. He wants everything that everybody wants, and therefore there is some of us in him, all of us, and therefore he appeals at some level to all of us. And nothing is off limits. Therefore, he's extraordinarily modern in a way. Yes. He was extremely unpopular amongst a lot of people, going to his club, taking down notes of conversations. I mean, he's not a gentleman.
One reason for reading biography is to get this feeling of how it was to be in another time, what it smelt like, what it felt like, what it tasted like, what they sounded like. The other reason is completely diametrically opposite, which is for reassurance, for saying, they were like us in a kind of a way. You know, if we had been there, it would have been all right, or human nature doesn't change, and a sort of wonderful gamut of humanitarian cliches that makes you feel a continuity with the generations, which actually is very important to us too. And I think Boswell does the both.
Reading this journal made me uneasy. It is preserving evidence against oneself. It is filling a mine which may be sprung by accident or intention. Were my journal to be discovered and made public in my own lifetime, how shocking would it be to me? And after my death, would it not hurt my children? I must not be so plain.
James Boswell found his great subject. Sometimes he called that subject Johnson, but more often he called it himself, and like no other writer in our literature, he wrote himself into existence. At the end of his own life story, Boswell seemed to fade in the shadow of his illustrious friend. His journal darkened and blinked out a year before he did. His spirits, which had always raged from pole to pole, were now quite resident in the northerly part of his nature. "Why go to London?" he wrote to his editor Malone not long before the end. "What have I to do there? I can see no prospect in life but a thick fog. Could I but recover those pleasing delusions which braced my nerves when I first entered Westminster Hall." Boswell died in May 1795 in London, and his remains were taken back to the family vault at Auchinleck. "I used to grumble sometimes at his turbulence," wrote Malone, "but now miss and regret his noise and his hilarity, and his perpetual good humour, which had no bounds. Poor fellow, he has somehow stolen away from us without any notice." But in our own time he has somehow stolen back, all that noise and good humour strangely intact. Boswell knew how to be pleased with himself, and could see his own genius. For me, he might well be pleased with himself, for he is endlessly pleasing. He had the strange power to be like all of us, and yet like no one else but himself.
There have been many people who have built castles in the air, but I believe that I am the first that ever attempted to live in them. What a singular being do I find myself. Let this, my journal, show what variety my mind is capable of. But am I not well received everywhere? Am I not particularly taken notice of by men of the most distinguished genius? And why? I have neither profound knowledge, strong judgment, nor constant gaiety. But I have a noble soul, which still shines forth. A certain degree of knowledge, a multiplicity of ideas of all kinds, an original humour and turn of expression, and I really believe a remarkable knowledge of human nature. I am a singular man.